Greetings, friends. This is Chris Batts, and you are listening to episode number 5 of the Future is Bright podcast. In today's episode, I spoke with Francois Henriquez, Executive Vice President, Chief Administrative Officer, and General Counsel of the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. We discussed his exciting career in big law, then navigating the 2008 crisis at a financial institution taken over by the federal government, and the incredible opportunity that opened up for him to go from General Counsel to President and CEO. We discussed his current role, why he feels he is the luckiest guy in the world, and why he loves his job. And friends, know that Francois has a truly special gift for people, so stay to the end to hear his approach to management and leadership and so much more. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this episode and to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes and YouTube. A bit more about Francois. Prior to joining the bank, Francois was a partner in the Miami office of Schutz & Boeing LLP, where he was a member of the Financial Services Industry Practice Group from 2012 to 2018. From 2009 to 2012, he was acting president of U.S. Central Federal Credit Union, where he operated the institution in conservatorship on behalf of the federal government. From 1993 to 2009, he was U.S. Central's general counsel and led a variety of other business units. Also, he was an associate with major law firms in New York for 5 years, and then was an associate and partner at 2 prominent Kansas City law firms. He has been an adjunct professor at the University of Kansas School of Law, where he taught banking law and lectured or presented on corporate governance, financial institution regulatory matters, capitalization strategies, and other corporate legal issues. Mr. Henriquez received a bachelor's degree in political science from Yale University and a JD from Columbia University School of Law. Welcome, Francois, to the Future is Bright podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Chris, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today.
So, Francois, I have had the pleasure of interacting with you at different, particularly a general counsel event we had in St. Louis, and I just knew that you would be a fantastic guest for the show. The moment we had a chance to chat, you have a grace and a gift for leadership, among many things. And so thank you for this time that we get to have today. Let's jump in. So you had shared with me that some of your origin is in South Florida, West Palm Beach. And tell me a little bit about upbringing and leading into, why did you go to law school?
Well, thanks, Chris, and thank you for your kind words. You're much too gracious. I did, in fact, I was born in and grew up in West Palm Beach, Florida. Mine is in some ways a fairly typical immigrant story. My father was born and grew up in Haiti. My mother was born in the Bahamas, and that's where she grew up. They met and married, and after a few years, they brought their 3 little daughters to West Palm Beach. And then a few years later, I was born. And so I'm the American boy in the family.
Okay.
They didn't have very much when they came to this country. And the thing that motivated them was to make a better life for their kids. And so they stressed education as really the only way to pull ourselves up. So that's really how it all started, Chris.
So did you always think you were going to be a lawyer at some point, or was it your journey when you originally started going to Yale, I noticed, for political science?
I think I pretty much wanted to become a lawyer because of watching the Watergate hearings as a kid, which gives you some sense of how old I am. I was fascinated not so much by the pomp and circumstance of the Senate chambers or even the hearings themselves. I was fascinated by how the witnesses needed to be coached by this unnamed individual to their sides, and that person seemed to be the counselor. And I realized I enjoyed providing advice and counsel, and that was my inspiration. And from there, I was hooked. And by the time I was 14, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, and it just went straight from there. I also decided, and I don't really know how I made this decision because I didn't have anyone in my family who had any experience similar, but I wanted to be, I wanted to go to the best possible schools, and I had it in my mind that I wanted to go to Yale undergrad and Columbia Law School. And that was my goal from the time I was 15. And as fate would have it, it happened to work out that way.
So tell me about that. Why Columbia? I mean, these are both very Ivy League driven schools, which is wonderful. And it's amazing how that foreshadowing, forecasting, and that desire created that opportunity for you. Tell me more.
Well, Chris, what I can tell you is sometimes it's easier to achieve things if you don't know that they're unattainable.
Right, right. Yeah.
So I really had no idea. And coming from
Awesome.
public schools in South Florida, the odds probably were really stacked against me. On the other hand, it was an era of affirmative action, and I think schools like Yale and Columbia were looking for people who were coming off of the main beaten path. And so maybe that gave me a shot as well. But I knew just enough to think that if I ever wanted to land as a lawyer on Wall Street, I probably needed the background of places like the Ivy League schools. And I had heard of Harvard, of course, and thought, but that just sounds a little too puffed up, maybe. Somehow, Yale just sounded more appealing to me.
That's awesome. Well, I love the swinging for the fences. I really value that in the story that began that for you. So going to Wall Street, or landing on Wall Street, you landed at Cadwalader. And was that one of the schools you interviewed with and knew or summered or had friends there, or how did that come about?
Yes, I had the good fortune of getting an offer to be a summer associate at Cadwalader, and I think things went well enough that they invited me to come back as an associate after I graduated from law school. I spent about 5 years there, mostly focused on corporate transactions of every sort: mergers, acquisitions, initial public offerings, private placements, you name it. It was whatever kind of transaction that came around. I was thrown on a team and really got to learn a lot about how to handle corporate transactions.
And then I noticed, so you've transitioned to a couple other corporate firms, more in the Midwest, Stinson and then Lewis Rice. Some of that transition, I believe, was was it more towards banking? Is kind of the experience that you began to get more exposed to?
That's right, Chris. When I moved to the Midwest, I realized that the corporate practice in the firms in the Midwest were not quite like those in New York, so that you couldn't just make a living moving from one type of transaction to another. You really needed to either specialize or you needed to have be deep in an industry where you knew a lot of people and they knew you, and so I knew quickly that I needed to specialize. And the firm, Stinson, actually had a pretty decent banking practice.
They do.
Lots of community banks. And so I thought, I need to become a banking lawyer. The only problem with that, Chris, is that they didn't teach banking law at Columbia, and I'd never had any courses in banking law. So it turns out that the University of Kansas, which is in Lawrence, Kansas, which is where I was living at the time, had just lost their banking law professor, and I was friendly with the dean of the law school, and he invited me to learn banking law by agreeing to teach banking law as an adjunct. So I was hard at it, practicing law all day, and then burning the midnight oil trying to learn banking law so that I could teach it on Monday evenings. A grueling experience. I did learn, but it was probably at the expense of the students that I had in my first class.
What an extraordinary experience to dive right in and then teach it at the same time. I probably don't know a better way of learning something than going through that process.
Well, you're starting to see a pattern, Chris. I jump in without necessarily knowing what I'm doing, and then I figure it out.
Well, you must be very graceful at it, because I know that you are very sought after for those skills as you continue to progress. So let's talk about that. So you tell us how you landed your first in-house role. Now, giving some foreground, and I'll let you do the bulk of this. You landed a role at U.S. Central Federal Credit Union. And it was a very significant time of our country's financial history, as well as your career and just opportunity. So please share that foreground and how this all occurred.
Sure. Out of the blue, really, a partner at Stinson who had done some large offerings for U.S. Central Federal Credit Union knew that they were starting to look for their first ever general counsel. And he actually just sent them my resume and reached out to me, and we began talking, and it was as simple as that. I was still in private practice. I really wasn't looking to go anywhere else. Things were going just fine. But it was at a time in my life when little kids were on the way. And, I thought maybe going the in-house route would make for a little better work-life balance than life in a law firm.
And did it?
It probably could have. I didn't allow it. I was just as busy. It was just a different kind of busy.
Yeah.
And so it was a little harder to manage a work-life balance than I thought it might have been. But I wouldn't trade it. It was a very exciting time. So I joined them as their first general counsel and as a senior vice president with a seat on the management committee.
That's amazing. And so you were there for nearly 20 years, and I know you were in that role for at least 15. What happened that led you to get this invite to the chief role?
Well, as I said, I started there as essentially general counsel and corporate secretary. We had a reorganization a couple years later, and I was asked if I would take on the responsibility for leading HR. It was supposed to be temporary, but it didn't ever go away. And after leading those two departments for a while, I was asked to take on dotted line responsibility for internal audit. And then the next thing I got was enterprise risk management, and then all external relations, which included government relations, industry relations, member relations. Then marketing came my way. And before I knew it, I was running a division that provided pretty much, I also had facilities, so I was responsible for our buildings. So before long, about 4 years into my tenure, I was running an entire division. And I was spending much less time on a day-to-day basis as general counsel and much more of my time as one of the leading executives. We did have, unfortunately, a little bit of turnover in our CEO suite while I was there. And so, as fate would have it, I became something of the continuity. I was the senior officer who managed to last through 5 different CEOs, and it was the only member on the management committee who was consistently on there that entire time. So as a result, I was known to the regulators. I was known to our members. I was known to the entire organization. Then fast forward to 2008, and we all know what happened in 2008. And our organization was overweight in mortgage-backed securities, frankly, and we were really struggling, and it was difficult because of our structure to recapitalize and reorganize. So ultimately, we didn't make it. We were put into conservatorship by our federal regulator, who at the time was the National Credit Union Administration. And I think because of my long relationships with the regulator, because I was a bit of a known quantity, because I'd had a lot of oversight over many areas of the bank, I was asked by the regulator to step in as the acting CEO. We knew that it was probably going to be necessary to liquidate, but because of the structure and the role that the organization played in the credit union industry, we couldn't liquidate it overnight. It needed to be managed downward. So I spent the next 3.5 years or so slowly downsizing it, trying to sell off key operations and keep them intact, and bit by bit letting go of the staff until I got down to the very end, and it was my job to turn off the lights, hand over the keys, and fire myself. So I was basically the end of the road there. It was a very challenging time, can tell you that.
What did you learn about yourself and learn about people who step into that kind of role as CEO? Yeah.
Chris, I learned that no matter how dark it seems, there is always a way to get to the other side. It may be very, very painful, but there's life on the other side. And you just have to maintain a steady keel. Make sure that you don't get lost in the tumult of the day. Keep your eye on the long game, and frankly, be very, very straight with everybody. We had a lot of employees that we needed to keep with us. I was able to negotiate retention agreements for them, but at the same time, they needed to know that I had their back. So one of the things I did, Chris, every single employee that we had to lose, I went to their office personally and explained to them that they were going to be leaving in 30 days. And I sat with them and I spoke with them and I thanked them for their service. Because it's you don't get anything done yourself. Everything that you do as a leader, you're doing through other people. So you've got to make sure that you believe in them and they know that you've got their back. And so they will believe in you and trust you and do what needs to be done. So that's probably the thing I learned the most from that experience. I learned a few other things too. Our management team fell into some cognitive traps like many management teams do. We had some people who had a halo effect. We didn't think that they could do anything wrong or they could make any mistakes. We also fell prey to the black swan trap. Since it had never happened, it couldn't happen. So we weren't prepared for certain kinds of events. So it made me quite a bit more questioning, of course, as I've gone through the rest of my career. Why do you say that? Why do you think that? Why do you think that couldn't happen? Who says? And what does that really mean? And are we prepared for this? What are we assuming that we shouldn't be assuming? So I'm constantly plagued with those kinds of questions now as a result of not being able to see the train coming towards us.
Love to maybe touch on that in a minute or two. So you transitioned and you went back to private practice, and was it back in South Florida? Was it Schutz Bowen, I believe? You were there for another 5 years?
Yes, that's right, Chris. A dear friend that I had met who's also a lawyer in the credit union industry invited me to return to South Florida and to join the law firm, very large law firm, very nice financial institutions practice, and I was being invited to grow their credit union practice. And initially I said, no, I thank you very much, but I don't have any interest. I left South Florida many, many years ago, not planning to return. I've already taken the bar exam in New York and Kansas and Missouri. I don't need to take another bar exam. I've spent almost 20 years in credit unions. I think I'll go into a different slice of financial services.
Right.
So I had all these reasons to say no. And Chris, I ended up doing all those things. I did take and pass the Florida bar exam. I went back into private practice. I returned to South Florida. And that was all fine. And it worked out very well. And I was pleased with it. But I got an opportunity. I was asked, again, another shot out of the blue. A recruiter reached out to me and said, would you by any chance be willing to go back to the Midwest? And I said, I don't know. He said, how about to return as a general counsel? I enjoyed being a general counsel. He said, how about at a Federal Reserve Bank? Well, then I was hooked. The U.S. Central Federal Credit Union, not to bore you, was built to be essentially an analog to a Federal Reserve Bank, but serving the credit union system.
Got it.
And it was located in the backyard, essentially, of the Kansas City Federal Reserve. So I was very, very familiar with the Federal Reserve, and we did a lot of work with the Federal Reserve of Kansas City. And I always was fascinated with the Fed from my initial Econ 10 class at Yale, and also all the work we did with the Fed when I was at U.S. Central, and of course as a banking lawyer. I've just always had a soft spot in my heart for the Fed. So it was just an opportunity I couldn't turn down. I loved being a general counsel before. Private practice was great, but I really enjoyed being a general counsel. So returning to the Midwest and taking on the role as general counsel of a reserve bank, I just couldn't say no.
Yeah, and this was the St. Louis one, not the Kansas City location,
yeah,
correct?
The St. Louis Fed. So
Okay.
Close, but a little the other side of the state.
And is it safe to say that each bank is different, or has I'm assuming, a different culture and things like that?
Yeah, each bank is very different from each of the others. As you know, and probably your listeners know, there are 12 Federal Reserve banks scattered around the country in locations that made a lot of sense in 1914 as to the centers of commerce as the U.S. was structured at that time. And so that's why you have 2 Federal Reserve banks in the state of Missouri. I don't think you would do that today.
Yeah, probably not.
but the cultures are very different. And I felt at home here at the St. Louis Fed almost from the day that I walked in. It's been great to be here.
So I have to say that I remember having conversations with you, one of our first phone calls, and you're like, I'm the luckiest guy in the world. You absolutely love your job, and the opportunity for you to make impact. So talk to us about this passion for your job. And you received a promotion. So I'd love for you to share with my audience, as much as you're allowed, your responsibilities right now, because you've got quite a bit.
Well, thanks, Chris. History doesn't always repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, right?
Yes.
I think I told you about my experience at U.S. Central. Well, 2 years into my tenure here at the St. Louis Fed, I was asked to take on the role of Chief Administrative Officer, and I now am responsible for a division that we call People, Strategy, and Administration. And that includes people and culture. You might think of it as human resources. Yeah. I also have a DEI team. I head up a group called Financial Management that includes the CFO, budgeting, forecasting, procurement, vendor management. Also, I have risk management consulting, that's enterprise risk, data privacy, business continuity, and strategic planning, as well as legal and ethics. And so we have 6 different vice presidents in our division, and I'm accountable to all 6 of them as their leader. It's been quite an interesting experience and challenge. So along with that came the promotion to executive vice president and chief administrative officer. So it's the role has morphed again. I don't spend very much of my time in day-to-day legal work. I'm now again responsible for being a senior executive at the bank and making sure the wheels run.
So provide a brief scope of 1,500 people. And
that's right. There are 1,500 people, more or less, that work at the St. Louis Fed.
Yeah. And I knew leadership was something that was a grace, but also something you've grown into and learned. Please share with my audience just insights from your journey, or specifically how you have a leadership philosophy and work with your team and develop people. What does that look like?
Chris, that has really evolved in the 25 years or so that I've been in leadership roles. When I first took on the role of general counsel, I thought my responsibility was to be the smartest lawyer in the room. And I quickly found out that I had lawyers on my staff who were technically quite a bit more capable than I was. And I had to wrestle with that for a little while. And then finally, it dawned on me that I was barking up the wrong tree. That wasn't what I was supposed to do.
Mm.
What I was supposed to do was lead the effort. There are many lawyers who understand the law very well, but they don't necessarily understand their clients very well or relate to their clients very well. And what I had to develop was the ability to explain the law to the business people and explain the business imperatives to the lawyers. So my job was really to go between and to make things run smoothly. Once again, if I hearken back, I was interested in going into this profession because I wanted to advise and I wanted to counsel. And being able to marshal the legal resources and then break it down into something that's meaningful for the business people was what I found I was good at. So I had great technicians working for me, but sometimes they couldn't step away from the technicalities to make it make sense, or to fit into the needs of the business people. So I found this little niche, and over time I came to understand I could really allow people to be good at what they are, and that I had a separate role to play. And over time, that's developed to the point where I now see myself as a coach. I use this metaphor all the time. I'm a little later in my career than the lawyers and the other vice presidents who report to me are. And I say to them all the time, I've won all my championships. I have all my championship rings. I'm not on the court anymore. That's not my job. You're on the court. I'm your coach. And what I want to do is help you grow to be the very best that you can possibly be. So I will coach you. I will mentor you. I will do it in real time. And I will give you every opportunity to shine. If you have a win, congratulations. If you have a loss, I haven't done my job as a coach. I've somehow let you down. So it's really, really morphed over time, Chris. And I believe very much in making personal connections with each of my vice presidents and the other people who report to me. Every one of them is different, and I need each of them to be able to play their role as effectively as possible. So it's important to me to get to know them extremely well, so that they can trust me and trust that the advice I'm giving them and the direction I'm giving them is for their best interest and will help them grow in addition to meeting the needs of the bank. So it is important for me to be vulnerable to them so that they can be vulnerable with me. Because what happens when that happens, Chris, is that people are willing to share their insecurities, and they'll tell you when they don't know, instead of hiding it or pretending that they know when they don't. And that's when you can really make things get to a higher level. So that's a little bit about how I think about my role today and how I think about leadership.
Francois, has there been people in your life that have influenced you in your way, in your superpower of doing this? Or books or things that have fed this journey for you?
Oh, well, lots of things here and there. I had a wonderful mentor at Cadwallader all those years back who really, really taught me how to write, and the importance of writing, and that writing is really the only way you can write well is if you train your brain to take a disciplined approach to the things that you think about and that you analyze. So, learned a lot about how to be analytical in that respect. I had another mentor, also at Cadwallader, who taught me a lot about the importance of having good bedside manner, treating everybody with respect, and always putting your client first. I think I had a great mentor when I first joined US Central who taught me the value of being very disciplined and organized. There's a management consultant that I met along the way who taught me about organizational dynamics, and this was something I always thought was kind of funny. He said that there are really only two kinds of people in every organization. They're stars and they're jerks. And that's the first thing you need to know. The only other thing you need to know is that stars will not work for jerks. And it's very simplistic, but it makes a lot of sense. And what it really means is that the tone is always set at the top. So I learned from a lot of those individuals and some other experiences that you're called upon in leadership, not just for leadership thinking, but for leadership behavior. You have to, people are constantly watching you, and they're taking cues from you as to what is acceptable, what is this culture like, and do people care about you? Are people honest? Are they full of integrity, or do they say one thing and then do another thing? So all of these things factor in. I didn't give you a very good answer, but there have been a couple of individuals here along the way who've been instrumental in shaping my views.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So kind of as we come to a close, Francois, how can people either find you, contact you, follow you on social media? What's your preference? What works best?
I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. In fact, there's only, as far as I can tell, one Francois Henriquez in all of LinkedIn or on Google. I have never found a second one.
That makes it easy. That's wonderful. That's excellent. So, Francois, it's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris. It's been equally an honor for me to be with you. Thank you so much.